Aisha's mother came out of her house in the middle of the night and turned into a goat. Unknown to her, I was by the window watching. That's the kind of story people in Kara like to whisper when the power goes out and the streets fall quiet. In towns like this, it's easier to believe in shapeshifters than to admit that real monsters are made from shame, silence, and fear. On a storm-soaked night in May, while the wind slammed loose doors against cracked walls, a different kind of secret unfolded, not one born of superstition but of desperation. In a dimly lit room behind a crumbling wall, a teenage girl named Zainab fought to keep quiet. The pain of childbirth hit her in waves, every contraction dragging her deeper into a panic that had been building for months. Alone, hunched over an old mat, she bit into her own arm to keep from screaming. The baby came fast, a boy, alive, loud, and angry at the world he had just entered. His cries cut through the night like sirens. She held him close, tried to hush him, and begged him under her breath to stop. Not now. Not here. Not like this. In her trembling arms, the boy kicked, wailed, and demanded to be known. And then, as her shaking hands pressed him closer, too close, everything went still. When the morning call to prayer echoed through the streets, Zainab sat slumped in silence. The child, wrapped in cloth, lay motionless. His cries had vanished, but something heavier remained. By noon, neighbors were gathered near the neem tree behind her house, pointing at freshly turned soil. Within hours, police would knock on her door. Was this a murder, or the final cry of a girl who saw no way out? In places where a girl's mistake is judged louder than a boy's crime, silence becomes survival. What happens when fear wraps itself around a teenager's throat tighter than love ever could? What does a girl do when her own body becomes a secret she's forced to carry alone? Have you ever known someone who had to keep quiet just to protect their family's name? Someone who smiled through shame, hoping no one would look too closely? Maybe it was a neighbor, a cousin. Maybe you've even seen it in your own home, eyes that say everything, lips that say nothing. Zainab Musa was 17, a top student, soft-spoken. Her biggest dream was to become a teacher one day. Instead, she found herself delivering a child alone in the dark, hiding the sound of her son's first breath from the world that should have celebrated him. Some people in Kara called her a murderer. Others said she was a victim of an unforgiving culture. But everyone agreed on one thing: what happened that night would shake the town forever. This isn't just about one girl. It's about the fear that still traps girls in rooms with no light, no help, and no second chances. So stay with us. Watch till the end. Let's talk about Zainab. Let's talk about what her story says about all of us. Like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe if you believe some stories deserve more than just judgment. They deserve to be understood. Kara was the kind of town where life didn't move in a rush. The sun rose early, waking the roosters and the barefoot children who chased each other past vendors setting up in the market. The calls to prayer echoed through narrow streets, and the scent of ground pepper, dust, and diesel lingered in the air. People greeted each other by name, watched whose daughter went where, and measured their worth in respect, not noise. In the middle of this quiet order lived Zainab Musa. At 17, she was known more for what she didn't say than what she did. She was the kind of girl who sat in the front row at school but rarely raised her hand. Her notebooks were always neat. Her uniform was clean, even if the hem had been stitched 3 times over. She helped her mother sell vegetables after school and read her younger brother Quran verses in the evening. Zainab's father, Musa, was a respected tailor in the community, steady, fair, with rough palms and strict eyes. Her mother, Hadiza, ran a stall in the local market, her voice always one level louder than necessary. Together, they built a household rooted in discipline, hard work, and family pride. Zainab was expected to finish school, maybe get a clerical job, and eventually marry someone chosen by the family. Dreams were allowed as long as they stayed within reason. But dreams are stubborn things. Idris wasn't from Kara. He was an apprentice mechanic from a nearby town, often seen fixing motorbikes under the neem tree near the mosque. His clothes were usually stained with grease, and he spoke with a confidence that made people pause. He and Zainab met when her brother's bicycle chain snapped. He fixed it in 5 minutes and refused payment. That small moment turned into greetings, which turned into conversations, which turned into something Zainab had no words for but felt deep in her chest. They never walked hand in hand. There were no love letters. Only glances passed in the market, whispered exchanges when no one was listening, and the occasional meeting under fading daylight. In Kara, a girl speaking to a boy outside her family was already enough to stain her name. So they kept everything quiet, carefully timed, fragile. Zainab didn't see Idris as rebellion. She saw him as a break from pressure, A reminder that she was more than a daughter, more than a name in a roll call. He listened. He made her laugh. He told her she could become anything, not just someone's wife. With him, her voice didn't feel small. But secrets like that don't stay small for long. When she missed her period, the weight of that discovery nearly knocked her breath away. She didn't need a doctor to confirm it. Her body was changing. Her stomach turned at the smell of palm oil. Her chest felt different. Every day after that, she wrapped herself tighter in loose-fitting wrappers and kept her head down. Her once perfect attendance at school started slipping. Teachers noticed. Her mother scolded her. But she said nothing. To speak was to invite destruction. In Kara, a girl who got pregnant without marriage wasn't just disgraced, she was erased. Some were sent far away. Others were forced into marriages overnight, often to men they barely knew. The shame didn't just stick to the girl. It dragged down her siblings, her parents, and even distant cousins. Nobody wanted their name whispered in that kind of story. So Zainab stayed silent. She stopped seeing Idris. Not because she stopped caring, but because she didn't know how to bring him into her fear. He wasn't the one who'd be blamed. She was. At night, she lay awake listening to her mother's prayers from the next room, wondering what would happen if the truth ever stepped through their front door. She still helped at the market. Still recited Quran verses. Still smiled when neighbors greeted her. But something in her had already shifted. And the town had no idea what was coming. The first sign came quietly. A skipped period. Then another. Zainab didn't panic immediately. Stress could do that, she told herself. But her body kept changing. Her chest ached. She felt dizzy in the mornings. Her favorite foods made her nauseous. When her uniform stopped fitting, she knew the truth wasn't going anywhere. She spent hours in front of the mirror, turning side to side, pressing her palms against her belly as if she could stop time by force. The thought of telling her mother barely crossed her mind. That wasn't a conversation. They didn't have the kind of relationship where tears brought comfort. Discipline came first. At school, her focus slipped. Words on the chalkboard became a blur. She stopped volunteering to read. During breaks, she avoided eye contact, especially with the girls who gossiped about anyone who walked differently. Teachers noticed. One asked if she was feeling unwell. She nodded but offered no explanation. Amina was the only one she allowed close enough to notice something was wrong. They had grown up on the same street, taken the same classes, played with the same skipping rope in primary school. Amina saw the change in her silence, the way she hugged her school bag tighter across her midsection. One afternoon after school, Amina didn't ask. She said, "Zainab, please." "I know." Zainab's eyes filled but she didn't cry. She just whispered, "Don't tell anyone. Please." That was the only part she could control. Amina begged her to talk to a trusted adult. A nurse. A counselor. Even a relative. But Zainab shook her head. "You don't understand," she said. "If anyone knows, I'll be finished. My family won't survive the shame. They'll marry me off or throw me out." Amina didn't have an answer for that. From that day on, Zainab became her own secret. She avoided gatherings. Skipped mosque. Took longer routes home to avoid familiar faces. When her mother asked why she wasn't eating, she said it was the heat. When her father questioned her absence from school, she blamed stomach aches. At night, she would lie on her back and count ceiling stains, pressing her palms against her belly and whispering apologies to a child who hadn't even arrived yet. Some days she thought about running away. But she didn't have anywhere to go. Other times she prayed for a miracle, something to erase it all before anyone found out. Fear turned into routine. Every movement was measured. Every word calculated. She stopped writing in her journals. Stopped making plans. Even her dreams shrank one by one. Her silence wasn't just about the pregnancy. It was about survival. In Kara, when a girl gets caught, it's not just her life that's judged. It's her parents, her siblings, even her future children's. A mistake like this could live longer than she did. The months passed slowly. Her clothes grew looser. Her world smaller. Amina stopped pressing her, but the worry never left her face. By the time Zainab entered her 9th month, there was no joy, no anticipation. Only the weight of hiding and the quiet knowledge that something had to give. She just didn't know how, or when. The clouds rolled over Kara with a quiet warning. Rain had been falling since late evening, soaking the earth and rattling tin roofs. By midnight, the streets were empty, the air thick with humidity, and thunder sounded like a fist slamming down again and again from above. Inside the Musa home, a dim kerosene lamp flickered in the corner of Zainab's room. The rest of the house slept. Her mother's breathing echoed from the next wall. Her younger brother stirred once and then settled again. Zainab couldn't lie down. Her knees buckled beneath her as pain gripped her lower back and stretched across her stomach in pulses. She had never felt anything like it. There was no one to guide her. No instructions. No hand to hold. Just her own muffled whimpers and a body that had decided this was the hour. She grabbed onto a low stool to steady herself. Sweat ran down her neck. She bit down on her sleeve to stop herself from crying out. Time lost meaning. One contraction blurred into the next. Her fingernails clawed into the floor as the pressure built. Her head throbbed. Her breath shortened. She felt the baby push. There was no turning back. In a corner of that small room, on a mat that had once belonged to her grandmother, Zainab gave birth. Her body shook as the child slid out of her with a force that left her gasping. A boy. Tiny. Alive. He cried immediately, sharp and loud. She looked at him with wide, panicked eyes. His voice filled the space around them, bouncing off the walls, louder than the rain, louder than the storm, louder than her thoughts. She picked him up, cradling him close. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please stop. Please stop. You didn't? She covered his mouth gently, trying to soothe him. Her hands trembled. She rocked him, pressed him closer. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She looked toward the door. One cry could bring her mother in. One scream could bring shame to the whole house. In those seconds, everything narrowed. Her hands pressed tighter. Her whispers turned into sobs. The baby struggled. Then he went quiet. She froze. She looked down. His chest no longer moved. Her eyes darted across the room as if someone else had just entered. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She shook him gently. Tapped his cheek. Nothing. The silence roared louder than the cries ever had. She stared at him. The blood. The cloth. The stillness. For a long time she didn't move. Her arms locked in place, her mind floating somewhere far from that room. The lamp sputtered once, then went out, casting everything into darkness. When the sun finally touched the sky, she wrapped the child's body in a torn wrapper and pressed it to her chest, the same way she had only hours earlier. Only now there was no weight, no movement, no sound. By the time the rest of the house stirred, Zainab had already washed her face, swept the compound, and changed her wrapper. Her movements were robotic. Her eyes hollow. She greeted her mother as usual, helped chop onions for the day's stew, and nodded when her father asked if she was going back to school next week. No one noticed the soil on her feet. That morning, when the neighborhood was still stretching awake, Zainab slipped out to the back of the compound carrying a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. The neem tree stood tall, unmoved by the night's events. At its base, she dug as deep as her hands would allow. The ground was soft from the storm. She worked quickly, pausing only when her breath hitched. With shaking arms, she placed the small body into the earth and covered it without a word. She walked back inside, washed her hands, and forced herself to eat. Later that day, the rhythm of town life resumed. Children shouting, traders haggling, neighbors exchanging news. Zainab sat quietly under the veranda, pretending to read an old school book. She thought maybe if she just kept going it would all fade. But the ground had other plans. Around noon, a neighbor named Binta came to fetch firewood from the shared back fence. As she walked past the neem tree, something caught her eye, freshly disturbed soil, a slight dip that hadn't been there yesterday. Binta bent down, poked the ground with a stick, and immediately stepped back. Her voice cracked through the compound. Musa, come. There's something here. By the time Zainab stood up, 3 neighbors had already gathered. Her mother rushed past her. One man had already begun digging. When the cloth emerged from the earth, everything froze. No one needed an explanation. The size, the shape, the smell. The truth rose too quickly to deny. An hour later, police arrived at the house. Neighbors whispered. Phones came out. Photos circulated before sunset. Some said she was heartless. Others said she was cursed. One woman stood outside the compound and wept, not knowing why. At the station, Zainab sat with her head down. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. When asked who the father was, she didn't answer. When asked why she had done it, her reply was barely above a whisper. I was trying to stay quiet. I didn't want anyone to know. But now everyone did. By nightfall, the story had left Zainab's compound and made its way into every corner of Kara. In the market square, beside heaps of tomatoes and baskets of dry fish, her name passed from mouth to mouth. She buried her own child, one woman said. A girl from Musa's house, another whispered. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others lowered their voices and asked, what pushed her that far? At the mosque, after the evening prayer, Clusters of men stayed back to talk. Some called it evil. Others blamed modernity, saying young girls had lost their way. A few remained quiet, staring at the floor, uncomfortable with how quickly judgment came. The imam said little, only that the town should pray for guidance. By the next morning, the story was trending on Facebook and WhatsApp. Photos of the neem tree circulated. A screenshot of her school ID made the rounds, followed by clips of people filming the house from across the street. The caption changed with every post, some calling her a murderer, others begging for compassion. Comment sections filled fast. "This is what happens when girls are left unsupervised," one wrote. "Where was the father of the baby?" another asked. "She should rot in prison," said one comment. But below that, "She needed help, not handcuffs." The town itself was split. On one side stood the traditionalists, elders who insisted this was about right and wrong, punishment and shame. On the other, a growing number of younger voices began to ask questions that hadn't been safe to raise before. Why had no one noticed she was suffering? Why is a girl's mistake treated as a family curse while the boy walks away untouched? What system exists for girls like her? Women's groups in nearby towns started organizing small forums. Some teachers began speaking up in school meetings. A nurse from the community clinic posted a video talking about mental health and isolation. It got shared hundreds of times. But not everyone welcomed the shift. A few town leaders warned against encouraging softness. They said sympathy would only invite more disgrace. That letting her off lightly would send the wrong message to other girls. In the middle of all this, Zainab remained silent. Her name had become a headline. Her face a point of argument. While the world outside argued about justice or mercy, she sat in a holding cell, staring at the wall, wondering what name they would give her next. At the station, Zainab sat quietly, hands folded on her lap. An officer offered her water, she shook her head. For the first 2 hours she said nothing. Not out of defiance but fatigue. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, stripped of any effort to defend herself. "I didn't plan it. I was scared. I just didn't want anyone to hear him cry." The officers didn't press her hard. There was no shouting. No threats. The case already had a life of its own. Their job now was to document what she said, pass it up the chain and wait for instructions. Her statement was recorded. She signed it without hesitation. Later that week, the case was formally charged in court. The state debated whether to pursue murder or infanticide. Under Nigerian law, a woman who causes the death of her child during or shortly after delivery can be considered for a lesser charge, especially if mental or emotional disturbances are involved. Prosecutors chose manslaughter. Still, the weight of the charge was heavy. The courtroom was small, its benches packed. Word had spread. Students came. Traders left their stalls early. Religious leaders sat in the back, eyes narrowed. Zainab appeared in a plain wrapper and blouse, head bowed. Her parents sat in the front row. Her father's face didn't move. Her mother gripped a handkerchief so tightly her knuckles turned white. The prosecution began with a sharp tone. They described the burial site, the disturbed soil, the wrapped body under the neem tree. They painted Zainab as reckless, claiming she made no effort to seek help, even from her family. They called her silence dangerous. Then the defense took over. They told the story from the beginning. A girl with no prior offenses. A strong academic record. A future derailed by fear. They reminded the court of how shame works in places like Kara, how silence becomes a defense mechanism when the truth guarantees punishment. But the turning point came when the court-appointed psychiatrist was called to testify. The doctor spoke with calm precision. He described Zainab's mental condition in terms that even the older men on the bench could understand. He talked about postpartum shock, about panic-driven decisions, about the kind of fear that isn't always visible but can lead to tragic consequences. She was not in a stable emotional state, the doctor said. Her judgment was severely impaired at the time of the incident. She showed signs of dissociation, emotional trauma, and overwhelming psychological distress. The courtroom was silent. Even the prosecution didn't interrupt. The judge listened carefully. He asked questions about her schooling, her family life, her behavior after the event. He didn't raise his voice once. His expression stayed even, but it was clear he was weighing not just facts but lives. After closing statements, he called for a recess. When court resumed, he delivered the verdict. Manslaughter. Not murder. The sentence: 5 years in a juvenile rehabilitation facility, with the option of early release pending psychological evaluation, consistent counseling, and continued education. There was no applause. No shouts. Just silence, and the sound of Musa exhaling for the first time in hours. Outside the court, reactions varied. Some said the sentence was too light. Others said it was a step toward fairness. But everyone knew one thing: this wasn't just about Zainab anymore. It was about every girl who had ever been forced into silence. Every family who had turned away when help was needed. Every town that had chosen shame over understanding. Zainab stood before the judge one last time. He told her, "What you did had consequences. But how you move forward will define the rest of your life." She nodded, eyes full but dry. The guards led her out, not to a prison but to a center where, for the first time in months, someone would ask how she was feeling, and wait for an answer. After the sentencing, Musa and Hadiza walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. They moved through the crowd like ghosts. Reporters held out microphones. No one in the family responded. That night, the family home remained locked. The lamps stayed off. The air was heavy. Hadiza cried quietly for hours. Not just for her daughter, but for herself. For not noticing, for not asking more questions, for being so strict that fear had taken the place of love. Musa didn't speak much. When he did, it was a question he asked aloud, not directed at anyone. What kind of home makes its child afraid to speak? In the weeks that followed, something began to shift in the town. At Zainab's old school, a small group of teachers began offering private counseling sessions for girls. A few local nurses volunteered to talk with students about reproductive health. A youth advocacy group from a neighboring city visited Kara and met with school officials. They offered workshops and distributed pamphlets, many of which were thrown away, but not all. Still, not everyone welcomed these changes. Some parents accused the reformers of encouraging rebellion. A few elders called the new programs foreign influence. One local cleric condemned the idea of discussing sex or pregnancy in schools altogether. Yet despite the resistance, the conversation had started, and it refused to end. Inside the rehabilitation center, Zainab began the slow work of healing. It wasn't a prison. There were no metal bars, no barking orders. It was quiet but not lifeless. The center offered therapy, vocational classes, and, most important for Zainab, a place where no one knew her past unless she chose to share it. She spent most afternoons in the library, often with a pen in hand. Staff noticed she rarely spoke during group sessions, but when given a notebook, she filled pages in silence. She began writing letters, to Amina, to her younger brother, to herself. Every evening, she sat by a small window in her room and wrote. It became a ritual. A place to lay her regret and her hope side by side. One entry stood out. Read. I wish I could turn back time. I wish someone had listened to my silent screams. I wish I had known there was help beyond fear and isolation. In my arms should have been hope, not despair. A copy of that page would later be printed and shared at one of the school forums. It was passed from hand to hand, not to excuse what happened but to remind everyone of what silence can cost. Zainab wasn't free. Not yet. But for the first time she wasn't hiding. The neem tree still stands behind the Musa residence, tall, weathered, and unchanged to the casual eye. For some in Kara, it's just another tree. For others, it marks the moment the town was forced to confront everything it once chose to ignore. It's where one life ended, and where another began again in silence. Today, a few community members gather near that tree to speak about progress. They don't talk loudly. They don't pretend to have all the answers. But they show up, because they know that behind closed doors, behind polite greetings and well-swept compounds, there may be more girls like Zainab. How many are still hiding their fear? How many walk into schools with secrets stitched beneath their uniforms? How many are told to protect the family's name at the cost of their own well-being? The real question is, what would you have done in her shoes? Let us know in the comments. Speak honestly, but speak with understanding. Your perspective matters here. And if this story moved you, if it made you think differently or look at your own community in a new way, like the video, share it, and subscribe. Stories like Zainab's don't just need to be told. They need to be heard, discussed, and remembered. Because silence may protect reputations, but it also buries truth. And the only way forward is through truth that's seen, spoken, and faced together.